Afghanistan is a land where, throughout long years until now, three world superpowers, who saw no rivals for themselves, boasted of their strength and sought worthy challengers, suffered humiliating defeats in the face of the bravery and sacrifices of this nation. The Red Army of the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on December 27, 1979, subjecting the country to its ruthless aggression. Afghanistan is geographically a strategically located country. It is situated on a piece of land on the Earth's surface that many countries, or most countries, needed in order to benefit from its geography for their own advantage.
It was a reality that the Russians had long-standing relations with Afghanistan under the name of friendship or proximity. These relations were established because, in Afghanistan, they supported the communists.
In Afghanistan, there were people who granted them the power and were ideologically Russian supporters. They were aligned with the communist ideology, as during that time, the world was divided into two main ideologies. One was imperialism, and the other was communism. These individuals held commonalities, and these commonalities led them to invite the Russians and call upon them to intervene in Afghanistan. During the 9 years of occupation and aggression in Afghanistan, Soviet troops carried out widespread and ruthless massacres. Any village or city that resisted them faced intense ground and aerial attacks, leaving behind only death, destruction, and signs of displacement.
When they entered to someone's house, they killed animals, killed humans, and burned homes. All of this destruction was carried out by the Russians. Eventually, these people who had invited the Russians realized that they were facing trouble, as their own communists began to fear that they would be dishonored and humiliated. To mitigate this, they would go to a village or homeland, asking whether the people were friends or enemies. Those who called them friends were seen as allies, but anyone who feared the cruelty and barbarity of the Russians and thought they were the enemy would inevitably be targeted and attacked.
In such a situation, when we talk about the people of Afghanistan, we have lost 1.5 million martyrs. If, in any given area, someone was to slaughter an animal, it would create a flood from the blood. 1.5 million is a significant number. Similarly, we had millions of disabled individuals, millions of refugees, and millions of people left homeless within their own country. This reality demanded resistance because the Afghan people had accepted this fate. Any struggle based on such principles would eventually lead to a result, and it would yield a positive outcome. It would bring about change. Thousands of Russian soldiers were killed and millions of our own people became martyrs in this war. In this unequal battle, more than 1 million people lost their lives and became victims. Nearly 5 million were displaced abroad, and more than 2 million were internally displaced, facing both temporary and permanent hardships. Additionally, 1/3 of the country's population became refugees, infrastructure was destroyed, thousands of homes were ruined. However, despite all this chaos and destruction, the brave nation of Afghanistan never submitted to occupation and colonialism and never welcomed their enemies. The people of Afghanistan are a traditional people and society, deeply rooted in their religion, Islam. They have always been able to defend their religion fiercely. One of the most significant examples of this is their resistance to the Russian invasion, their defense against the Russians.
They would deploy powerful forces, such 4,000 of tanks, vehicles, and airplanes, which they would use to invade homelands. In those regions, they would oppress the people, enter their homes, steal their belongings, kill civilians, and burn down houses. These actions were the same things that fueled the growing hatred and animosity towards them. With each passing day, the people's resistance and hostility toward them intensified.
At
first, the Mujahideen did not believe that they would be able to defeat a superpower in Afghanistan. They never imagined that they would actually bring about the collapse of such a powerful force. However, the Mujahideen were driven by a sense of duty, as they saw their struggle as a jihad. Their goal was clear: to fulfill this duty. They were prepared to become martyrs, but they did not initially think that this fight would lead to the liberation of their country because they didn't have the experience.
The reason for this was that, ideologically, neither the regime in Afghanistan nor the Russians could come to terms with the Afghan people. There was an ideological clash between them. This clash and conflict were the driving forces that led the people to resist, and they fought vigorously against the invasion. The Afghan people stood firm for many years. Even the women of our society played a crucial role in this struggle, contributing and participating actively. After a decade of resistance, the Russians were eventually forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. Consequences of February 15, 1989, in Afghanistan and the world. Liberation of Afghanistan and the end of the Soviet Red Army's occupation. Collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Rescue of the world from communism, materialism, and atheism. Failure of the Kremlin's ambitions to reach the warm waters of India and the oil-rich Gulf countries. Defeat of the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of Eastern European socialist states that was the main ideological and strategic rival of NATO. Fall of the Berlin Wall, the most significant symbol of the Cold War, which had divided Berlin into East and West Germany and was also known as the Iron Curtain. The Russians did not anticipate that Afghanistan would become a battlefield for them or a place where they would face defeat. The reason for this was that those in power in Afghanistan provided them with misleading information. They did not fully understand Afghan society. Russian General Gramov mentioned in his writings, the Afghan rulers had given us incorrect information. Despite having spies who were gathering information from Afghanistan, there was still a disconnect with the actual reality on the ground. Nonetheless, we were still compelled to invade Afghanistan.
If a person looks at it, the success of the Afghan people was that they defeated a powerful country, and they achieved their independence. This victory over the Soviets was a significant accomplishment for Afghanistan. On the other hand, the failure of the Soviets was evident in the disintegration of the states that had once been united under their control. Their failure was also seen in the severe damage to their economy. Ultimately, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a result of their failures in a small country. Just a region named Moscow was left for them. All the other regions were liberated. To this day, the region continues to experience the consequences of that loss and the impact of the freedom that came out of it.
The Soviet Union, with 130,000 troops, invaded and occupied Afghanistan. However, over time, as they faced disastrous consequences and suffered a humiliating defeat, it became clear that attacking this proud nation was one of the Kremlin's greatest foreign policy mistakes of that era. This mistake remains a permanent stain of disgrace and shame on their record. On the 26th of Jadi, 1358, January 16, 1980, Special Forces of the Red Army, with the support of Afghan army soldiers, assassinated Hafizullah Amin, the then president, and took control of key government facilities in Kabul, thereby occupying Afghanistan. This marked the beginning of a bloody and full-scale war for future generations, with devastating global consequences in Afghanistan. If we look at it from a logical or rational perspective, an unjust war was started, with one side being a global superpower and the other side being a relatively weaker people. However, the resistance of the people was based on their belief, rooted in their ideology. Their ultimate goal was martyrdom, and they didn't initially hope that the Soviets would leave Afghanistan, and to bring a system in the country. Finally, history unfolded in such a way that Russia, defeated, had to leave Afghanistan. When the last Soviet soldier crossed the Amu River on February 15, 1989, the withdrawal of the Soviet Red Army from Afghanistan was complete. After this defeat and retreat, no one believed that the Soviet Union would soon collapse, disintegrate from its core, and vanish from the stage of history. The Russians with their defeat, lost their political standing and military power that they had in the worldwide. To this day, Russia has not regained the position it once had, the one it should have maintained. If the Russians had not fought this war in Afghanistan, or if they had not lost, so that they would have remained a force in the world, with a dictatorial regime that would have been feared, like no one would have had the power to stand against them. They received more harms than us. According to official statistics, the Soviet Union lost 14,751 soldiers in Afghanistan, including the missing, which means that the Red Army lost approximately 1,613 soldiers each year in Afghanistan, suffering irreparable losses. This figure does not include the casualties from the Afghan communist troops, which were not counted in these statistics. The number of war-disabled and injured individuals is estimated to be around 470,000. During the 10 years of the war, about 620,000 Soviet military personnel actively participated in battles in Afghanistan. The Russian army was well organized, and the loss of even a single soldier was a significant issue for them. They never expected to be involved in such a protracted and intense conflict, and losing a soldier in battle was a severe blow. Thousands of soldiers were lost, and from this, we can infer that when the United States invaded Afghanistan, Gorbachev made a statement that was broadcast by the BBC. He said, "We have several lessons for America to learn. We hope they understand." One was that just as they are sending forces into Afghanistan, they should accept that one day they will have to leave. Secondly, he mentioned that for any number of troops entering Afghanistan, they should count them carefully, and when they leave, they should count again. Thousands or hundred thousands of troops will be lost, he warned, adding, "We are still searching for the limbs of our soldiers in Afghanistan, and many are still missing." It should be noted that Soviet losses were not limited to just human casualties. According to official statistics, 451 helicopters and military and civilian aircraft, 147 tanks, 443 artillery pieces, and 11,369 trucks and fuel tankers were destroyed in the Afghan war. These heavy and costly losses severely weakened the Soviet Union both economically and militarily, leaving it in a dire situation. The war in Afghanistan cost the Soviet Union nearly $50 billion, which crippled its financial capacity and left its economy in a state of paralysis.
The Russian helicopters would come, and would martyr Mujahideen. However, the Mujahideen did not have defensive weapons to counter these helicopters at first. Over time, though, they acquired weapons. They gradually found artillery and captured it as spoils of war. They also received help, and even managed to capture tanks and armored vehicles. Eventually, the Mujahideen reached a point where they were fighting the Russians with similar weaponry. At times, the Mujahideen even used weapons like the Stinger missile, which rendered Russian helicopters and planes ineffective. Once the Mujahideen obtained the Stinger, no more helicopters or planes could fly freely. As a result, Russian casualties increased significantly. The Mujahideen also found rockets and began targeting Russian tanks. With these new weapons and growing experience, the Mujahideen effectively started destroying Russian tanks, especially by planting mines. In the beginning, the Mujahideen suffered heavy casualties, but as time passed, the Russian casualties mounted and their losses became much higher.
With the Soviet Union's military invasion of Afghanistan, which led to bloody wars and the collapse of the country's political, economic, and social foundations, several of the Mujahideen, in the post-war period, failed to reach an agreement on forming a unified government and living peacefully alongside each other. As a result of these conflicts and divisions, what the general Afghan population faced was as follows. Destruction of physical assets and national infrastructure. The war destroyed physical assets and national infrastructure, severely damaging production and trade, and contributing to the spread of poverty. Decrease in population and displacement of human resources to neighboring countries. Migration and seeking refuge were, without a doubt, forced options, as people turned to them only in times of emergency and desperation. They endured the hardship of fleeing in the uncertainty of migration, choosing an unknown future. Weakening of social cohesion among the nation. Social cohesion across the country weakened, and the war deepened social and economic divisions. Death of tens of thousands and the widowhood and orphanhood of thousands of women and children. The depiction of the situation was on the shoulders of the fighters. Those who were in the trenches, those who were actually fighting, were the mujahideen. They portrayed the reality of the battle. The political leaders, however, were the ones who gave the situation a certain narrative, but unfortunately, in the context of the war with the Russians, this struggle was often idealized. The political figures tried to paint a beautiful picture of the struggle, but their approach was disconnected from the reality on the ground. Their political maneuvering became detached from the real conditions of the war, and they became entangled in matters that didn't focus on the actual needs of the fighters.
However, what followed was that when the Mujahideen achieved success, it turned into a misfortune for them. This misfortune didn't affect all the Mujahideen, but rather a number of them. The reward they had gained through their blood, the fruits of their sacrifices, migration and misfortune, couldn't maintain. They started civil war and conflicts against each other, and those conflicts caused that the honor and dignity of the Mujahideen which were once achieved, were lost as a result.
The effects of war are devastating. The progress that might have been achieved is lost, and the society that is shaped by war suffers in all aspects, whether intellectual, social, or economic. After a conflict, nothing progresses as it should, and everything is left behind. In Afghanistan, when the Russians invaded, the country faced the same setbacks. The economic goals that had been set, or either the social foundations that should have been in place, or the intellectual foundations that should have been in place, were lost due to the war. The cause of this loss was the conflict itself, driven by the actions of those Afghan groups who were motivated by their own interests and who, in the end, were manipulated by the Russians to secure their own goals. The Soviets found an opportunity in Afghanistan, competing with other powers for influence, and used the geography as a way to secure their future. This geography became a source of conflict, leaving the country vulnerable to decades of turmoil. The aftermath of this war and the struggle for control have left scars that we still bear today. The ongoing hardships are a direct result of the war that the Russians waged in Afghanistan. But praise be to God, the united front of true Afghan Mujahideen, under the leadership of one leader, one banner, one front, and one goal, began their struggle against the forces of evil and corruption. They succeeded in raising the white flag and the sacred Mohammedan slogan in the blue sky of our country, bringing a peaceful life to our people and nation.